Hello, everyone. History remembers only a few men whose names still echo long after empires have turned to dust. Among them stands one whose very existence defied the destiny of a world. Hannibal Barca, the son of Carthage, the man Rome could never forget. He was born in a time when his homeland lived under the shadow of a rising empire, Rome. What he inherited was not power, but a vow, a promise made before the gods, whispered in the language of vengeance and honor. From that moment on, his life no longer belonged to himself, but to history. From a boy in the camps along the Mediterranean, he grew amid the clash of steel and the smoke of conquest. He learned to read the battlefield as others read scripture, with reverence and precision. As his youth was forged in blood and iron, Hannibal became something the world had never seen before, a mind that not only mastered war, but understood men, their fear, their pride, their faith. He led armies through mountains of ice and plains of fire, defeating legions that claimed to be invincible. He made Rome, the symbol of order and might, tremble for the first time in its history. And yet, like every great flame, his brilliance consumed the path it illuminated. Betrayed by his homeland, forgotten by his age, Hannibal never bowed. He did not die on the battlefield, but in solitude, and that death was not an end, but a vow made eternal. For Rome could destroy Carthage, but it could never erase the name Hannibal Barca, the man who proved that the will of one soul could make an empire afraid. Hannibal was born into that world of tension in 247 BC, in a city already trembling at the memory of its first war with Rome. His father, Hannibal Barca, was a general, a man who had fought Rome tooth and nail in the First Punic War, and who had watched his homeland's pride drown with the loss of Sicily. Hamilcar was a soldier made of vengeance and fire, and he would pass that fire to his son. When Hannibal was just 9 years old, his father took him to the altar of Baal-Hamon, the god of Carthage. There, with the smoke of sacrifice rising and the sea roaring in the distance, Hamilcar made his son swear a vow that would define his life. "Swear to me, Hannibal," he said, "that you will never be a friend of Rome." And the boy placed his hand upon the offering and swore, a vow not written in blood, but carved into destiny. From that moment on, Hannibal Barca ceased to be a child. He became a weapon, forged by his father's hatred, tempered by discipline, and destined to strike at the heart of Rome. Under his father's guidance, Hannibal grew up in Hispania, modern Spain, where the Carthaginians rebuilt their strength after their first defeat. There he learned everything that would make him one of history's greatest commanders: the art of ambush, the patience of siege, the language of soldiers, and the silence before death. He learned to ride, to fight, to lead, and above all, to think. The young Hannibal was not reckless. He was calculating, calm like the sea before a storm. He studied men as he studied maps. He understood fear, not as an emotion to avoid, but as a weapon to wield. When Hamilcar Barca died in battle, Hannibal was still in his youth, but the legacy had already taken root. It passed to Hasdrubal, his brother-in-law, who continued Carthage's expansion across Iberia, until one day he too fell to an assassin's blade. Then, at the age of 26, the soldiers of Carthage turned to Hannibal. They lifted him upon their shields, shouting his name, and proclaimed him commander of the armies in Spain. The vow made at 9 years old was about to come alive. The fire of vengeance would now march in flesh and blood. For Rome had grown arrogant, and Hannibal Barca was about to remind the world that Carthage had not forgotten. In the year 218 BC, the ancient world trembled once more. Rome stood proud, rich, disciplined, arrogant, certain that its walls, its legions, and its destiny were invincible. But far to the west, in the rugged hills of Iberia, a storm was gathering. A young general, dark-eyed and silent, gathered his armies beneath the banner of Carthage. He was 28, fearless, brilliant, and haunted by an oath made before the gods. His name alone sent whispers across the Mediterranean: Hannibal Barca. Rome had broken its treaties, Rome had meddled in Carthage's lands, and Rome would soon learn the meaning of vengeance born from patience. Hannibal did not wait for war to come to him. He carried it to Rome's very doorstep. With an army of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, he began one of the most audacious campaigns in human history. From Cartagena in Spain, across the Pyrenees, through the rivers of Gaul, into lands no army of his kind had ever dared to march. His destination, Italy itself, the beating heart of the Roman Republic. But between him and Rome stood the impossible, the Alps. Mountains that scraped the heavens, where even eagles feared the wind. A frozen labyrinth of cliffs, storms, and death. No army in history had crossed them from the west. To the Romans, the Alps were a wall built by the gods to protect their empire. Hannibal saw not a wall, but a gateway. When his officers pleaded with him to turn back, he looked upon the snow-capped peaks and said, "I will either find a way, or make one." The march began. Men from Africa, Spain, and Gaul trudged through blizzards they had never imagined. Their bronze armor froze to their skin. Their elephants screamed as they slipped upon the ice. Snow swallowed the living and the dead alike. But Hannibal marched on. That night, between the mountains and the storm, Hannibal stood still, watching the snow cover the dead. In the flashes of lightning, he saw no enemy, only himself reflected in the eyes of the shivering men standing by the cliffs. Those eyes asked him, without words, "Will we live to see the dawn?" And he understood that if he faltered for even a heartbeat, the fire within them would die. "Those who fear death," he said, "look down, there lies the abyss. But those who fear living without history, look at me." In that moment, Hannibal was no longer just a general. He was the will of Carthage itself, a city made flesh, walking through the frost of the gods. The mountains were no longer obstacles, but a trial set by destiny. And when the army marched on, it was said that the wind upon the peaks changed its course, as if even nature bowed before a spirit that refused to yield. He rode at the front, never behind, his presence a fire against the cold. When an avalanche buried 1,000 men alive, he ordered the survivors to dig through the ice with bare hands. When food ran out, he shared his rations equally. He did not ask for loyalty, he earned it. For 15 days, the army of Carthage climbed the mountains of death, and when at last they reached the summit, the world stretched before them, vast, white, endless. Hannibal stood there, cloaked in snow, and pointed to the south. Beneath the clouds lay the green plains of Italy, the land of Rome. "You are standing," he told his soldiers, "on the borders of their empire. Beyond those hills lies the city that has insulted your fathers and enslaved your brothers. I bring you not just war, I bring you victory." With fewer than half his army surviving, Hannibal descended from the Alps into the valley of the Po River. His men were starving, wounded and frozen. But they had achieved the impossible. They had crossed the roof of the world. The Romans could not believe it. When scouts brought news that a Carthaginian army had appeared in northern Italy, the Senate laughed. It was said that one senator muttered, "If Hannibal is in Italy, then we are already doomed." They were right. Within weeks, Hannibal rallied the tribes of Cisalpine Gaul, turning Rome's enemies into his allies. His elephants roamed the Italian fields like beasts from another world. And as Rome scrambled to gather its legions, Hannibal struck. At the river Trebia, in the cold of winter, he lured the Romans into a trap. His cavalry swept around their flanks while hidden soldiers rose from the icy waters behind them. In a single day, an entire Roman army was annihilated. It was not just a battle, it was a message. Rome was no longer the hunter. Rome was the prey. From that frozen victory began a campaign that would haunt the Republic for 2 decades. A war not fought for territory, but for the soul of the ancient world. For Hannibal did not merely seek to defeat Rome, he sought to unmake it. And in the years to come, he would come closer to that goal than any man in history. The snow of the Alps had melted behind him, but the fire of vengeance still burned ahead. Hannibal stood now in the heart of Italy, where Rome's pride was thick in the air, and its legions waited in arrogance. To them he was a barbarian invader, a ghost from the west. To him they were prey wandering blind into the jaws of fate. After Trebia, the Romans thought he would retreat. But Hannibal never moved backward. He moved only toward destiny. The year was 217 BC. The morning mist rolled over the waters of Lake Trasimene like a shroud. And within that mist, Hannibal hid an entire army. He had chosen the place with surgical precision, a narrow road trapped between the lake on one side and steep hills on the other, a perfect coffin for a Roman army. When the legions of the consul Gaius Flaminius marched into that valley, they saw only fog and silence. They thought Hannibal had fled again. Then the mountains roared. From every hilltop, Carthaginian horns sounded. Thousands of men and horses descended like thunder, crashing into the Roman ranks from all sides. There was no formation, no retreat, no command. The fog turned red. By midday, 15,000 Romans were dead or captured. It was one of the greatest ambushes in history, a masterpiece of deception, timing, and terrain. But Hannibal did not celebrate. He watched the smoke rise over the corpses and whispered, "This is not yet Rome's punishment. It is only the beginning." The Senate of Rome was in chaos. Panic spread through the Republic like a plague. They called upon a single man, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Delayer. He refused to fight Hannibal head-on, choosing instead to harass and exhaust him, to bleed him slowly. It was the first time Rome learned caution. But patience is fragile in politics. When the people of Rome grew tired of waiting, they demanded battle, a final decisive confrontation that would crush the invader once and for all. Hannibal heard of it and smiled. He would give them their battle. He would give them Cannae. On the dry plains of Apulia, in the summer of 216 BC, the two greatest forces of the ancient world faced each other. Rome had assembled 8 legions, over 80,000 men, the largest army it had ever fielded. They were confident, disciplined, and hungry for vengeance. Hannibal had 50,000, weary, outnumbered, but bound together by genius. He stood before them and spoke not as a commander, but as a prophet. "Today we stand at the edge of immortality. Behind us lies Carthage's pain, before us, Rome's pride. Fight not for gold, but for glory. Fight not to live, but to be remembered." He arranged his army like a bow, the center curved outward, his flanks drawn back, his cavalry waiting in silence. When the Romans charged, they hit the center hard, pushing it inward. It seemed Hannibal was breaking. But that was the trap. As the Roman ranks pressed forward, the Carthaginian wings swung inward like jaws closing around their prey. Then the cavalry struck from behind. The Roman army was surrounded, trapped in a human circle of death. Men screamed, suffocated, were crushed by their own comrades. It was not a battle. It was an execution. By nightfall, 50,000 Romans lay dead on the fields of Cannae. The ground was so thick with bodies that, for centuries, farmers said their ploughs still struck Roman bones. Never before, and never again, would Rome know such a defeat. When the news reached the city, the Senate did not weep. They locked the gates, forbade mourning, and swore the Republic would rise again. But deep inside, they knew the truth. The Republic had been wounded in its very soul. As for Hannibal, he did not march on Rome. He stood upon the battlefield, staring towards the north, and said nothing. Some say he hesitated. Others say he understood that Rome was more than a city. It was an idea, and ideas could not be taken by storm. Cannae was his greatest victory, but it was also the peak from which his fate would begin to descend. Yet victory, like every fire, carries within it the seed of its own ashes. After Cannae, Hannibal stood upon the blood-soaked plain, where the wind no longer smelled of iron. He heard no cheers, only silence. The silence of men who knew they had reached the summit, from which there was no path forward. That night he did not sleep. Inside his tent, by the flicker of a dying torch, Hannibal wrote upon wax tablets, messages for Carthage. He needed reinforcements, gold, faith. But across the sea, they argued about politics, pride, and fear. Hannibal realized that from this moment onward, he would not only fight Rome, he would fight the indifference of his own homeland. Carthage, he whispered, I have carried war to Rome's gates for you. But perhaps the true enemy is not beyond your walls. It is within the hearts of those who have forgotten why we took up the sword. The wind passed through the tent. In the darkness, Hannibal felt something strange. That victory had not strengthened him, but aged him, as though each triumph had taken a piece of his soul. For in the silence after triumph, even gods hear the whisper of destiny changing direction. After Cannae, the world seemed to stand still. For a moment Rome trembled on the edge of annihilation, and all of Italy whispered the same name, Hannibal. The invincible republic had bled. Its pride lay broken beneath Carthaginian spears. And yet, even as victory stretched its hand toward him, Hannibal did not seize it. He had shattered Rome's armies, but not its spirit. The city behind its walls still breathed, stubborn, wounded, unyielding. Hannibal waited for allies to rise, for cities to rebel, for Carthage itself to send reinforcements. But none of them came. Carthage, blinded by politics and fear, refused to send him the legions and supplies he needed. The Senate of Carthage debated while Hannibal bled. And as the years passed, Rome learned from its mistakes. They no longer sought glory. They sought endurance. Under the leadership of Fabius Maximus and later Scipio Africanus, Rome stopped fighting Hannibal's war and made him fight theirs. For 15 years Hannibal roamed the Italian peninsula like a ghost. From Capua to Tarentum, from the mountains of Apulia to the plains of Campania, he struck, vanished, and struck again, his tactics flawless, his discipline unshaken. No Roman dared meet him in open battle. He became a myth, a name used to frighten Roman children. Hannibal at Portus. Hannibal is at the gates, but even legends grow weary. His army thinned, his allies faltered. The war elephants had long since died. The Italian cities that once whispered his name now feared Rome's vengeance more than they admired his courage. And in the distant east, a new Roman star began to rise, Publius Cornelius Scipio, a young general who studied Hannibal's every move, who had survived Cannae as a boy and sworn to avenge it. Scipio struck where Carthage was weakest, not in Italy but in Spain. He severed Hannibal's lifeline, conquering Iberia, cutting off the flow of men and gold. By 204 BC, the tide had turned. Scipio carried the war to Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest son. When the summons came, Hannibal was in the south of Italy, staring across the plains he had conquered, his face older, his eyes darker, but the same fire still alive. He knew what the order meant. It was not a call to return, it was a call to end. He gathered his veterans, the remnants of 15 years of war, and sailed home to defend the city that had forgotten him. The year was 202 BC. On the plains of Zama, near Carthage, the two greatest minds of the ancient world faced one another, Hannibal Barca and Scipio Africanus. One, the teacher of war; the other, his most devoted student. When they met before the battle, it was said that Hannibal looked into Scipio's eyes and saw himself, younger, relentless, unbroken. They spoke not as enemies, but as equals. Hannibal, with a faint smile, said, "Fate is a strange mistress. She gives victory to those she once betrayed." Then they parted, each knowing that only one of them would live in history as the savior of his people. Hannibal's army stood strong, 50,000 men, war elephants, and the last pride of Carthage. But Scipio's legions were disciplined, deadly, and supported by the Numidian cavalry that once fought for Hannibal. In the chaos of battle, the elephants panicked, trampling their own lines. The Carthaginian formation broke. And when Scipio's cavalry returned to strike from behind, Hannibal's fate was sealed. The Battle of Zama was not just a defeat, it was the death of an empire. Carthage was forced to surrender, pay enormous tribute, and swear never again to wage war without Rome's consent. Hannibal returned to his city not as a conqueror, but as a relic of its glory. Yet even in defeat, he refused despair. He reorganized Carthage's finances, rebuilt its economy, and for a time even served as suffet, the highest political office. His reforms restored prosperity. But Rome never forgave the man who had once brought it to its knees. Accused of plotting once more against the Republic, Hannibal fled his homeland, becoming a wanderer among foreign kings. He offered his wisdom to those who still dared to resist Rome, to the Seleucids in Syria, to the Bithynians in Asia Minor, but each alliance ended in betrayal. Old, hunted, and exiled, he found himself cornered by Roman envoys demanding his surrender. Rather than be paraded as a trophy through Rome's streets, Hannibal smiled faintly and said, "Let us free Rome from her fear of an old man." He raised a vial of poison to his lips. As the poison touched his lips, he looked to the sky and smiled, not the smile of defeat, but of a man who had walked the full length of destiny. Perhaps in that instant he saw again the snowy peaks, the plains of Cannae, the nameless soldiers who had once shouted his name before falling. He knew that his body would perish, but his will would not. For those who have looked upon the limits of mankind and stepped beyond them no longer belong to time itself. And so in 183 BC, the heart that had terrified Rome finally ceased to beat. Centuries have passed since Hannibal Barca took his final breath, yet his name still lingers like thunder beyond the mountains of time. To Rome, he was the monster at the gate, the terror whispered by mothers to restless children. To historians, he remains a riddle, a man who should have conquered the world, but instead became a symbol of how brilliance can devour itself. He was a genius of war, unmatched in his understanding of the battlefield. He read terrain like a poet reads emotion, turned rivers into traps, storms into weapons, and men, simple soldiers, into instruments of destiny. Even Rome, who prided itself on discipline, was forced to remake its entire way of war in his image. Every Roman general who followed, from Scipio to Caesar, studied Hannibal as both a warning and a guide. But for all his genius, Hannibal was also the embodiment of tragedy. He won every battle that mattered except the last. He shattered Rome's legions, crushed its pride, but could not break its will. He marched across mountains and empires only to find himself alone, wandering through foreign courts, a relic of glory that frightened kings as much as it inspired them. What does it mean, then, to be great? To burn so bright that the heavens themselves seem to bend in awe, only to be swallowed by the darkness of your own success? Hannibal's story asks that question of every soul who seeks power. For what good is victory if the world you build from it cannot outlive you? Carthage fell, but Hannibal endured, not in flesh, but in fear. Rome could not erase his name, for his shadow lived in every legion that marched after him, in every general who dreamed of conquest, in every empire that rose believing itself immortal. He became the echo that haunted all who would rule. They say that when Scipio Africanus grew old, he was once asked which commander was the greatest in history. He answered without hesitation, "If there had been no Scipio, there would have been no Rome, but if there had been two Hannibals, the world itself would not be enough." Hannibal was more than a man. He was an idea that courage can defy destiny, that vengeance can shape empires, and that the price of greatness is often solitude. He never ruled an empire. He never built monuments of marble. He left no dynasty, no heirs. And yet his legend survived where empires crumbled. Because while Rome conquered the world, Hannibal conquered time. His tale, like Alexander's, is both light and shadow, a mirror reflecting the endless struggle between ambition and mortality. Alexander sought unity through conquest. Hannibal sought justice through vengeance. Both reached for eternity, and both found it, not in the empires they built, but in the stories humanity could never stop telling. So when we speak of greatness, when we whisper the names of those who dared to challenge the impossible, we remember the man who crossed mountains, defied empires, and fought a world alone. Hannibal Barca, the storm that made even Rome afraid of its own shadow. History does not remember peace. It remembers struggle. It remembers the fire, the defiance, the men who looked at the impossible and said, "I will not bow." And among those men stands Hannibal Barca, not as a conqueror crowned in gold, but as a soul carved from will and fury. He never ruled an empire, yet he ruled the imagination of centuries. He lost his homeland, yet gained immortality. For every empire that came after Rome, every general, every dreamer, every tyrant would study his name and whisper in awe or in fear. This is how close a man can come to defying fate. The Romans destroyed Carthage, but they could not destroy the man who had already conquered their pride. Even in death, Hannibal remained their lesson, their nightmare, their mirror. He proved that genius and madness are sometimes only a heartbeat apart, that the brightest flame of ambition always casts the darkest shadow. And so, when the dust of centuries settles, When marble crumbles and empires fade into memory, his story still walks beside Alexander's. Two men born in different worlds, but united by the same unrelenting hunger to go beyond human limits. They remind us that greatness is never gentle, that to dream beyond your age is to stand alone, that to reach for eternity you must be willing to lose everything, even yourself. And in the whispering winds over the ruins of Carthage, if one listens long enough, one might still hear his vow echoing across time. "I will never be a friend of Rome." Not a cry of hate, but a declaration of defiance. The eternal heartbeat of a man who refused to kneel before the inevitable. Hannibal Barca, the thunder that walked on two legs, the warrior who fought gods and men and became legend. Don't forget to like and follow the channel for the latest video updates.